The Silent Road. It was a typical autumn night, the wind howling through the narrow streets of Pine Hollow, a small town nestled between mountains. Cold air seeped through every crack, gnawing at the bones, while the leaves crunched underfoot like brittle paper. By midnight, the town had settled into a tranquil slumber, save for a single figure standing at the edge of the woods. Her name was Emily, a 25-year-old with a penchant for adventure. She wasn't a thrill-seeker per se, but something about the dark, the unknown, always intrigued her. Tonight, she was determined to do something her friends had teased her about for years. Walk down Harper's Road, a place where, according to town folklore, no one ever returned from. Harper's Road wasn't on any map, not anymore. It lay abandoned, a crumbling strip of pavement winding deep into the forest, shrouded in darkness and overgrown with vines. It had earned its reputation after a series of mysterious disappearances over the decades. No one really knew what happened to those who ventured too far down it, but the locals had plenty of theories, everything from wild animals to ghosts to something much worse. Emily, however, wasn't buying it. She thought it was all superstition, a tale told by the older folks to keep kids from wandering off into the woods. Tonight, she would prove it. She tightened the strap of her flashlight around her wrist and took a deep breath. Her feet crunched over the gravel as she stepped onto Harper's Road. The first stretch of the road was uneventful, save for the oppressive silence that blanketed the forest. Not even the sound of birds or the occasional rustling of critters stirred. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Emily pressed on, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the thick blackness. The trees stood tall and ominous, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. Every so often, her mind played tricks on her, causing her to see shadows darting between the trees. After about 15 minutes, she stopped to catch her breath, her heart thudding in her chest. She had reached a bend in the road where the air felt heavier, colder. As Emily stood there, staring down the road that stretched out endlessly before her, she realized that she hadn't seen any sign of wildlife. No deer, no rabbits, no birds. It was unsettling, to say the least. Suddenly, the beam of her flashlight flickered, sputtering before it went out completely. Emily fumbled with it, hitting the side of the plastic casing with her palm, but it remained stubbornly dead. Panic rose in her throat as she looked around, the darkness now absolute. Her breaths came out in shallow puffs of steam in the cold night air. She had walked far enough, she reasoned. It was time to turn back. But as she spun around to retrace her steps, her stomach dropped. The road was gone. Where there should have been the rough, gravelly path leading back to Pine Hollow, there was nothing. Just trees, dense, towering trees that seemed to shift in the darkness, their outlines vague and blurry. Emily's chest tightened as she realized she was completely, utterly lost. "This is impossible," she whispered to herself, taking a few shaky steps forward. She must have taken a wrong turn, right? She was sure she had followed the road straight. Trying to remain calm, she reached for her phone, only to find that there was no signal. She held it up, waving it around as though that might help, but the screen showed only one word: searching. A sudden snap echoed from behind her, the sharp crack of a twig breaking. Emily's body went rigid. The sound hadn't been close, but it hadn't been far either. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Slowly, she turned to face the direction of the noise. At first, there was nothing, just the endless rows of trees standing like silent sentinels. But then she saw it. Movement. Between the trees, something was there. It was faint, a shadow shifting among the branches, its shape barely discernible in the gloom. Emily strained her eyes, trying to make out what it was. Her heart froze. It was a figure. Tall, thin, and draped in what looked like ragged, tattered clothing. It stood perfectly still, as if watching her from the edge of the woods. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figure tilted its head ever so slightly, the gesture unnervingly human. "No," she whispered, stepping back instinctively, her feet crunching over the fallen leaves. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, half obscured by the trees, like it was waiting for something. Without thinking, Emily bolted. She ran as fast as her legs would carry her, her feet slamming into the uneven ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get away from whatever that thing was. The trees whipped past her in a blur as she ran, the cold air biting at her face, tears streaming from her eyes. Behind her, she could hear it. The faint sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, following her through the woods. They weren't running. They didn't need to. The footsteps were measured, calm, as though the figure knew that no matter how fast she ran, it would catch up to her eventually. Emily's legs burned as she pushed herself harder, darting between the trees, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't keep this up for long. She needed to find a way out. She needed to... She stumbled. Her foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling onto the ground, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Pain shot through her ankle as she tried to stand, but her leg gave out beneath her. She had twisted it. Badly. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, all was silent again. Emily lay there, gasping for air, her body trembling from adrenaline and fear. She glanced over her shoulder, her vision blurred by the darkness. The figure was there, closer now, standing at the edge of the clearing, no more than 20 feet away. It still hadn't moved from its spot, but Emily could feel its gaze locked on her, piercing through the night. Slowly, painfully, she dragged herself backward, inching away from the figure, her hands scraping against the rough earth. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, the shadows pressing in around her, suffocating her. Every breath felt labored, her chest tight with dread. Then the figure moved. It took one slow, deliberate step forward, its foot crunching over the leaves, then another, and another. Emily's heart raced as she tried to pull herself farther away, but her injured leg made it impossible. She was helpless, lying there in the dirt, watching as the figure closed the distance between them with agonizing slowness. She wanted to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. Fear had stolen it from her. Just as the figure stepped into the moonlight, revealing its full form, Emily felt the world around her tilt. Her vision swam, darkness encroaching from the edges of her sight. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the figure's face, or what should have been its face. There was nothing there. Just smooth, featureless skin where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Emily awoke to the sound of birds chirping. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting warm, golden light over her body. She was lying on the side of the road, her backpack beside her, and her phone clutched in her hand. Disoriented, she sat up, her heart still racing. Her ankle was sore but not broken. The forest looked normal, peaceful even. There was no sign of the figure, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. She glanced down the road and saw Pine Hollow in the distance. She was close to home. Had it been a nightmare? A hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion? Emily didn't know, but one thing was certain. She was never going back to Harper's Road, and neither should anyone else.